They refused her credit at the general store. By sundown, the richest cowboy in 3 counties was standing at her broken fence without saying a word. Before we go on, tell me where you're watching from, because stories like this travel farther than the wind, and out here, justice rides quiet. Eleanor Hayes had learned to live without asking, the kind of living that turns a woman into stone from the inside out. Raising 2 children in a shack that measured barely 12 by 16 feet, its boards warped by winters that never seemed to end, its roof patched with scraps that rattled like loose teeth whenever the north wind came down hard. Noah, 10 years old, already walked like a man twice his age, counting every crumb before he ate, while little Lily still believed hunger was something you could sleep away if you held your mother's hand tight enough. That morning, Eleanor had walked the full mile into town, boots worn thin, dress faded to the color of dust, and stood beneath the creaking porch of Miller's store, asking not for charity, just time. "One more week," she said, her voice steady, her eyes level, because dignity was the last thing she owned and she guarded it like fire in winter. But time, in a place like that, was worth more than money, and the men behind the counter exchanged looks that said everything before a word was spoken, shaking their heads slow, polite, final. She didn't argue, didn't beg, just nodded once and turned back the way she came, the road, stretching ahead like something that had no intention of ending. Back at the cabin, she broke the last heel of bread into 3 pieces, the smallest for herself, though neither child noticed, and when the fire burned low, she reached beneath a loose stone by the hearth and pulled out a folded letter, the paper worn soft from being opened and closed too many times. She had written it weeks ago, by lantern light, every word chosen like it cost her something, addressed to a man she had never met, but had heard about in town. Caleb Whitaker, the kind of name people lowered their voices around, not out of fear, but respect. She had never sent it, because asking felt too much like surrender, and surrender was something she had promised herself she would never teach her children. So she read it once more, lips moving without sound, then folded it back and slipped it beneath the stone, burying the words the same way she buried every need she could not afford to show. That night, the wind died down, leaving a silence so complete it felt like the land itself was holding its breath, and somewhere in that quiet, something shifted, though Eleanor couldn't have said what, only that she woke before dawn with a strange stillness in her chest, as if the world had changed while she slept. When she stepped outside, the cold bit hard against her skin, the sky just beginning to pale, and that's when she saw it. Fresh hoofprints pressed deep into the frost, leading straight to her door, stopping there, and not a single knock to explain why. The hoofprints did not circle the house or wander off toward the hills. They ended right there at her door as if the rider had come with purpose and left without a sound. And Eleanor Hayes stood still for a long moment, the cold air settling into her lungs while her eyes traced each deep impression in the frost, measuring distance, weight, intention, because out here nothing appeared without reason. Behind her, the door creaked open just enough for Noah to peer through, his voice low, careful, asking if someone had come in the night, and she did not answer right away, not because she did not know, but because something about the silence unsettled her more than any knock ever could. She stepped forward, boots pressing into the same frozen ground, and noticed the spacing of the tracks, steady, controlled, not the kind made by a man in a hurry or a stranger unsure of his welcome, and that told her more than any face could have. Lily appeared next, wrapped in a blanket too big for her. Small shoulders, eyes wide with that quiet hope children carry even when they have no reason to. And she whispered if maybe someone had brought food, the kind of question that lands soft but cuts deep, and Eleanor turned back toward the house before answering, because hope was a fragile thing, and she would not let it rise without reason. Inside, the cabin held the same stillness as the land outside, the fire reduced to ash, the air thin and cold, and for a moment it felt as if nothing had changed at all, as if the prints outside were just another trick of light and frost. But then she saw it, something she knew had not been there before, resting against the far wall near the table, half in shadow where the early light barely reached. It was a small bundle, wrapped in canvas, tied with a simple leather strap, not large enough to be called a delivery, not small enough to be ignored, and her breath slowed as she stepped closer, each movement deliberate, cautious, because gifts without explanation carried weight out here. Noah closed the door behind them. The sound soft but final, and neither child spoke as she knelt beside the bundle, her fingers hovering just above the knot as if touch alone might reveal the truth. The leather was new, clean, nothing like the worn straps they used, and when she finally loosened it, the knot gave easily, almost as if it had been tied for her to open, not to keep closed. Inside, there was no gold, no grand gesture, just simple things placed with care: a sack of flour, enough for a week if stretched thin, a small tin of coffee, the kind she had not tasted since before her husband passed, and beneath those, folded with precision, a blanket thick enough to hold back a winter night. Lily's breath caught first, then Noah's, but Eleanor said nothing, because something else lay at the bottom, something that did not belong to supplies or survival. A single piece of paper, folded once, its edges crisp, its presence heavier than everything else combined. She knew that paper before she even touched it, knew the weight of it, the way it had rested beneath a stone by her hearth, hidden from the world and from herself, and when her fingers closed around it, the room seemed to narrow, the air tightening as if the walls themselves were listening. Slowly, she unfolded it, and there it was, every word she had, written in the quiet of a long night. Every line she had chosen and then refused to send, her name at the bottom, her plea between the lines where she thought no one would ever see it. Noah stepped closer, his voice barely more than breath, asking how it could be there, how something buried in their home had found its way into another man's hands. And Eleanor did not answer, because she did not have one, only the growing certainty that someone had crossed more than distance to stand at her door. She moved to the window then, pushing it open just enough to let the cold rush in, her eyes scanning the horizon where the land stretched wide and empty, but not as empty as it had been yesterday, because far off, where the road bent near the ridge, there was a figure, still as a fence post, mounted, watching, not approaching, not leaving, just waiting, as if the moment between them had not yet finished speaking. The rider did not move, not when the wind shifted across the ridge, not when Eleanor Hayes stepped out onto the porch with the letter still trembling in her hand, and distance stretched between them like a question neither had yet answered. She narrowed her eyes against the pale morning light, measuring the man the way she measured everything that came near her home, not by what he carried, but by what he did not do. And he did not urge his horse forward, did not raise a hand, did not call out her name. He simply remained there, steady as if he had all the time in the world and no need to claim any of it. Behind her, Noah whispered that the man could be the one from the stories, the one the town spoke about in low voices, the one who owned land farther than a man could ride in a single day. And Eleanor felt the weight of that thought settle into her chest. Not fear, not quite. Something quieter, something that asked why a man like that would come this far for a woman who had nothing to give. She folded the letter once more, slower this time, as if the act itself might reveal an answer, but the paper stayed the same, her words unchanged, only now they had been read by eyes she had never expected to meet. The children watched her, waiting for a decision she had not yet spoken, and Eleanor understood that standing still was also a choice, one that could last too long if she let it. She stepped down from the porch, boots touching the frozen ground where the hoofprints still held their shape, and for a moment she placed her foot inside one of them, testing the depth, the size, the certainty of it. And it was larger than she expected, deeper, the mark of a horse well-fed and well-kept, not one that wandered without purpose. She moved past the yard then, each step slow, deliberate, not closing the distance, only acknowledging it, because some spaces were not meant to be crossed in a hurry. The man on the ridge shifted slightly, not enough to be called movement, just enough to show he had seen her, that he was not a shadow or a trick of the morning light. And when he finally turned his horse, it was not away from her, but along the ridge, parallel to her path, as if he understood the line she was drawing and chose to respect it. Eleanor stopped, watching him move, the horse's gait smooth and unhurried. And in that quiet motion there was something she had not expected, not pity, not obligation, but restraint, the kind that belonged to a man who knew exactly what he could take and chose not to. Noah stepped closer to her side, his small hand brushing against her sleeve, and asked if they should follow, his voice carrying that careful balance between hope and caution. And Eleanor did not answer right away, because the answer was already forming somewhere deeper than words. She looked back once toward the cabin, toward the bundle now opened, the blanket draped over the chair, the flower resting on the table, and then back to the ridge where the man continued his slow path, never looking back, never asking to be followed. She understood then that whatever had brought him here was not finished, that the letter had not ended when it was read. It had only begun to speak in a way she could not ignore, and as the distance between them held steady, neither closing nor widening, Eleanor Hayes took a breath that felt different from the ones before it, steadier, as if something unseen had shifted inside her. And for the first time in a long while, she stepped forward not because she had to, but because she chose to see where the path might lead. The distance between them held like a line drawn in dust, and Eleanor Hayes understood that if she crossed it, she would not be stepping into charity, but into something far harder to name. The man on the ridge continued along the horizon, his horse moving with that same unhurried rhythm, never rushing, never pausing, as if he trusted the land to carry his intentions farther than words ever could, and that quiet confidence unsettled her more than any demand would have. Behind her, the cabin door creaked again, Noah calling out that the wind had shifted and the fire inside was catching stronger than before, the kind of small change that felt bigger than it should, and Eleanor turned halfway, just enough to see the thin thread of smoke rising straighter now, no longer broken by the gaps in the roof she had patched too many times to count. Something had been fixed, she realized, something she had not touched, and the thought settled into her bones with a weight that was not fear, not gratitude, but recognition. She walked back toward the cabin then, each step slower than the last, as if the ground itself had changed beneath her feet, and when she reached the door, she noticed the hinge moved smoother, the wood no longer catching the way it always had, a small thing, easy to miss, unless you were the one who had lived with it for years. Inside, the air felt different, warmer without reason, and Lily sat near the hearth wrapped in the new blanket, her small hands tracing the stitching along the edge as if it held a story she could almost understand, while Noah stood by the table, measuring the flower with careful eyes, already planning how long it could last if they stretched it thin enough. Eleanor closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment, the letter still folded in her hand, and she realized that nothing given here had been done by accident, not the bundle, not the repairs, not even the silence that had come with it. She moved to the window again, slower this time, and looked out toward the ridge, but the man was no longer there. Only the long stretch of land and the faint line where horse tracks faded into distance, as if he had never been at all, yet the proof of him remained in every corner of her home, in the steadier fire, the stronger door, the quiet sense that someone had seen more than she had allowed anyone to see. Noah asked then, in that careful way he had learned, if the man would come back, and Eleanor did not answer right away, because the question was not simple, not something you could measure like flower or distance. Instead, she unfolded the letter once more, her eyes moving over the words she had written in a moment of quiet weakness, and for the first time, she noticed something she had missed before, not in the ink, not in the lines, but in the way the paper felt, as if it had been handled again, folded not just by her hands, but by someone who had taken the time to understand what it carried. She pressed it flat against the table, her fingers resting on the edge, and said softly, more to herself than to the children, that some men do not return the way you expect. And Noah frowned slightly, not understanding, while Lily simply held the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Outside, the wind picked up again, but it no longer slipped through the cracks the same way, and Eleanor Hayes stood in that small cabin, feeling the difference in every quiet detail, knowing that whatever had begun with that letter had not ended with a single visit. And somewhere beyond the ridge, a man rode on without looking back, leaving behind a question that had only just started to take shape. The day did not rush forward. It unfolded slow, like frost melting off wood one quiet inch at a time. And Eleanor Hayes found herself listening to the house, as if it had begun to speak in ways she had forgotten how to hear. The fire held longer now, the warmth steady, no longer fighting the wind but standing its ground, and even the floor beneath her boots felt different, less hollow, less tired, as though someone had understood where the weakness lived and chosen to mend it without leaving a mark. Noah worked in silence at the table, measuring flour with a care that belonged to a man who had learned too early that waste was a luxury, while Lily sat near the hearth, humming something soft under her breath, the kind of tune that only appears when a child feels safe enough to forget the cold for a while. Eleanor moved between them, not speaking, not needing to, her thoughts tracing back to the ridge, to the man who had come and gone without taking anything in return, and that was the part she could not set aside, not the supplies, not the repairs, but the absence of demand, the way he had left the balance untouched, as if what he had done was not a transaction but something else entirely. By midday, the light shifted across the room in long, pale lines, and Eleanor stepped outside again, drawn not by hope, not exactly, but by a quiet need to see if the land would offer any answer the house could not, and the yard held its stillness, the hoofprints fading now under the slow work of sun and time, their edges softening until they no longer spoke as clearly as they had at dawn. She walked the perimeter of the cabin, noticing things she had stopped noticing months ago, the way the fence post no longer leaned, the way the latch sat clean in its place, the way even the old water bucket had been set upright instead of left on its side. Small things, each one easy to overlook, but together they formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Noah joined her after a while, his steps careful, his eyes scanning the distance the same way hers did, and he asked again, quieter this time, if the man had done all this just because of the letter, and Eleanor looked at him, really looked, seeing not just the boy but the weight he carried, without complaint, and she answered in a voice just above the wind that sometimes a letter does not ask for help the way we think. Sometimes it simply tells the truth, and the right man knows what to do with that truth. Noah nodded, though it was clear he did not fully understand, and maybe that was for the best, because some things were not meant to be learned too early. As the afternoon stretched on, the sky deepened into a colder shade, and Eleanor felt that same quiet shift return, not outside this time, but inside her chest, a sense that waiting would no longer be enough, that standing still, even with dignity, could become its own kind of silence, the kind that no one hears. She went back inside, reached beneath the hearth, and for the first time did not return the letter to its place beneath the stone. Instead she held it, folded but not hidden, and moved to the table where Noah had been working, her hand resting beside his for a brief moment, grounding them both in something steady. Lily looked up from the fire, her eyes bright in a way they had not been for weeks, and asked if they were going somewhere, and Eleanor did not answer right away, because the answer was not yet a destination, not a place on any map, but it was a direction, and sometimes that was enough. She stepped back outside, the cold meeting her again, but not biting as deep, and turned her gaze toward the ridge where the man had last been seen, and though he was gone, the line he had drawn remained, invisible but certain, stretching beyond what she could see. And Eleanor Hayes understood then that the next step would not be given to her the way the last had been. She would have to take it herself, not because she owed him anything, but because something in his silence had reminded her that she still could. The decision did not arrive like a storm. It settled in slow, the way light fills a room without asking permission, and Eleanor Hayes stood at the edge of her yard with the folded letter in her hand, feeling its weight as something different now, not a burden, not a confession, but a direction she had refused to follow until this moment. The land stretched out before her in that wide, quiet way that made a person feel small if they let it. But Eleanor had never been small, only quiet, and there was a difference she was beginning to remember. Behind her, the cabin held steady, no longer leaning into the wind, no longer whispering its weakness through every crack, and that steadiness gave her something she had not felt in a long time, not comfort, but footing. Noah stepped beside her again, his eyes tracking the horizon the way a grown man would, not searching for answers, but for signs, and Lily stood just behind them, wrapped in that thick blanket, her small fingers gripping its edge, as if it connected her to something larger. Then warmth. Eleanor looked down at them both, then back to the ridge, and for a moment she saw it not as distance, but as a path someone else had already traveled, not to escape, not to conquer, but simply to arrive and leave without taking more than what was offered. She took a step forward then, not far, just enough to feel the ground shift under her weight, and that small movement carried more meaning than any long journey she had made before. Noah noticed first, his voice low, asking if they were going to follow the tracks, and Eleanor shook her head gently, because this was not about following anyone. It was about no longer standing still. She turned instead toward the old shed that sat half-broken at the side of the yard, the one she had ignored for months because fixing it had felt like a promise she could not keep, and she walked to it with a steadiness that surprised even her. Pushing the door open to find the tools inside no longer scattered, no longer rusted beyond use, but arranged, cleaned, as if someone had seen what she would need before she had allowed herself to need it. She picked up the hammer, testing its weight, and for a brief second her hand hesitated, not from doubt, but from memory, because the last time she had held it, her husband had stood beside her, showing her how to set a nail straight, how to strike with intention instead of force. She closed her eyes for that one breath, then opened them again, and the past settled where it belonged, not gone, not forgotten, but no longer holding her in place. Noah stepped closer, watching her, waiting, and Eleanor handed him a piece of wood, simple, rough, something to hold, something to measure, and he took it without question, because he understood that this was not just about fixing a wall, it was about learning how to stand again. Lily moved nearer the doorway, the blanket slipping from her shoulders just enough to show she was no longer hiding inside it, and she smiled in that quiet way children do when they sense something changing without needing it explained. Eleanor raised the hammer, her grip firm now, and brought it down in a clean, steady strike, the sound sharp in the still air, echoing just far enough to be heard beyond the yard, beyond the line where the land began to rise. Somewhere out there, beyond sight, a man rode on, not looking back, not waiting for thanks, and Eleanor Hayes struck the wood again, this time without hesitation, because whatever had begun with a letter she never sent had become something else entirely, something she could build with her own hands, one measured step at a time. The sound of the hammer did not fade quickly. It lingered in the open air, carried just far enough to remind the land that something here had changed, and Eleanor Hayes kept her rhythm steady, not fast, not forceful, just certain, each strike landing where it needed to, each movement building something that had been waiting longer than she realized. Noah worked beside her now without being told, holding boards in place, adjusting angles the way he had seen done before, his small hands careful, but learning, and there was a quiet pride in the way he stood straighter with each passing minute, as if the act of helping was giving him something food alone never could. Lily stayed near the doorway at first, watching, her blanket slipping further down until it rested at her feet, forgotten, and then she stepped forward too, carrying small nails one by one, placing them within reach, her part small but steady, her presence no longer hiding from the cold but standing in it. The shed began to take shape again, not all at once, not perfectly, but enough to hold, enough to mean something, and Eleanor felt that same shift inside her deepen, not hope exactly, but a kind of quiet ownership over what came next. Time moved without notice until the light began to soften, stretching shadows long across the yard, and when Eleanor finally paused, lowering the hammer, she realized the silence around them had changed as well, no longer empty, but filled with the echo of effort, of breath, of something alive. Noah wiped his hands against his worn pants and looked out toward the ridge again, not searching this time, just aware, and he said quietly that the man had known what to fix first, and Eleanor nodded once, because that was true, but it was not the whole truth. She set the hammer down and walked a few steps away from the shed, turning slowly to take in the cabin, the fence, the ground they stood on, and she saw it clearly now. The difference was not only in what had been repaired, but in what had been started. She reached into her pocket and unfolded the letter again, the paper softer now from being handled, and she read it not as a plea, not as a confession, but as a moment in time that had led her here, to this yard, to this work, to this choice. The wind moved through the open space, but it no longer cut the same way, and Eleanor Hayes stood with her children in that quiet, feeling something settle that had been unsettled for far too long. Then, just as the sun dipped lower, casting the ridge in a deeper shade, Noah spoke again, his voice barely above the breeze, saying he thought he saw something moving far out where the land curved. Not close, not near enough to call, but there, a shape against the fading light. Eleanor did not turn quickly, did not rush to confirm it, because she understood now that not everything needed to be chased or proven. Some things simply needed to be acknowledged. She looked once, just enough to see the faint outline of a rider moving along the horizon, distant, steady, not coming toward them, not leaving in haste, just continuing, and she felt no urgency to follow, no need to call out, because whatever connection had been made did not depend on distance or presence anymore. She folded the letter one last time and slipped it into her coat, not to hide it, but to carry it forward. And as the light faded and the air cooled again, Eleanor Hayes stepped back toward the cabin with her children beside her, knowing that the work ahead would not be easy, would not be finished in a day, but it would be theirs, built piece by piece, with steady hands and a silence that no longer meant being alone. The night settled in without ceremony, a slow dimming of the sky until the land turned the color of ash and shadow, and Eleanor Hayes stood for a while longer outside the cabin after the children had gone in, listening to the quiet that no longer felt empty but full of something she could not yet name. The ridge was barely visible now, just a darker line against the fading light, and wherever the rider had gone, he had taken nothing that belonged to her, leaving behind only what she had needed without knowing how to ask for it. Inside, the fire held steady, its glow warmer than it had been in weeks, and Noah sat close to it, not for heat alone, but for the comfort of watching something constant, something that did not flicker and fail the way so many things had before. While Lily had already curled beneath the thick blanket, her breathing soft and even, the kind of sleep that comes only when fear loosens its grip, Eleanor closed the door behind her, her hand resting for a moment on the latch that now fit clean and sure, and she felt again that quiet understanding that none of this had been done halfway, none of it careless or rushed. Every detail placed as if someone had walked through her life without being seen and chosen exactly where to mend. She moved to the table and set the letter down, unfolding it once more under the low light. And this time she read it slower than before, not searching for what she had written, but for what had been answered without a single word added. Her eyes paused on the lines where she had spoken of winter, of the children, of the fear she had never let them see. And she realized that the man who had read this had not simply responded, he had understood, and there was a difference that settled deep in her chest. Noah looked up then, his voice quiet, asking if the man would ever speak to them, if he would come back and say what all of this meant. And Eleanor held the letter between her fingers, feeling its worn edges, and answered that some men speak in ways that do not need voices, and it is up to the rest of us to decide if we are listening. The boy nodded slowly, not fully grasping the weight of it, but accepting it the way he accepted most things now, with a quiet patience that belonged to someone older than his years. The fire cracked softly, sending a brief glow across the room, and for a moment Eleanor saw the cabin not as it had been, but as it could become, stronger, steadier, a place that did not merely survive the seasons but stood through them. She folded the letter again and placed it not beneath the stone this time, but inside a small wooden box on the shelf, where it could be found, where it could remain part of what came next instead of something hidden away. Outside, the wind moved across the land again, but it no longer found its way inside the way it once had, and that absence of cold spoke louder than any presence ever could. Eleanor Hayes sat down at the table at last, her hands resting still for a moment, and in that stillness she felt something unfamiliar yet certain, not relief, not gratitude alone, but a quiet resolve that had been given space to grow. And somewhere far beyond the ridge, under the same darkening sky, a man rode on without turning back, leaving behind no promise, no claim, only the kind of silence that changes a life long after the sound has faded. Morning did not arrive with noise. It slipped in through the edges of the cabin, pale light touching the table first, then the floor, then the faces of two children who had slept deeper than they had in weeks. And Eleanor Hayes was already awake, sitting still with her hands folded, listening not for what might come, but for what had changed. The fire had burned low but not out, holding just enough warmth to greet the day, and she rose without hurry, adding a single piece of wood, watching how the flame caught quickly now, steady, as if the house itself had learned to breathe again. Outside, the frost lay thinner than the day before, the ground beginning to show through in patches, and Eleanor stepped out with quiet purpose, her boots finding familiar ground that no longer felt as unforgiving. Noah followed soon after, rubbing sleep from his eyes, but already alert, already watching, and Lily came last. The blanket draped loosely around her shoulders, no longer clutched tight, just carried out of habit. They stood together for a moment, not speaking, the kind of silence that belongs to people who no longer need to fill it. Eleanor moved toward the shed again, her pace steady, and Noah joined her without being asked, picking up where they had left off, the rhythm of work returning easily, naturally, as if it had always been there waiting beneath the weight of harder days. The boards fit better now, the structure holding its shape, and with each measured strike of the hammer, Eleanor felt the distance between what was and what could be begin to close. Lily wandered along the edge of the yard, tracing lines in the frost with her foot, humming softly, and every so often she would look toward the ridge, not searching, just remembering. By midday, the sun had climbed higher, casting a clearer light across the land, and Eleanor paused, lifting her head slightly, as if sensing something before seeing it, a shift not in the wind, but in the stillness itself. Far out, where the road curved beyond sight, a wagon moved slowly into view, not fast, not urgent, just steady. The kind of movement that carried intention without needing to announce it. Noah saw it next, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of the shape, and Lily stopped her wandering, standing still as if the moment had asked her to. Eleanor did not move right away, her hands resting on the handle of the hammer, her breath even, because she had learned something in the quiet of the past days, that not every arrival needed to be met with urgency. Some needed to be understood first. The wagon came closer, its wheels turning slow, the horses well kept, their pace measured, and as it neared the edge of her land, it did not cross the line. It stopped, just as the rider had before, holding that same distance, that same respect. A man sat at the front, not the one from the ridge, but someone who carried the same stillness, the same quiet certainty, and he did not call out, did not wave. He simply waited. Eleanor set the hammer down then, wiping her hands slowly against her skirt, and stepped forward a few paces, not closing the distance entirely, just enough to acknowledge what had come. Noah stayed close behind her, his posture straight, his eyes steady, while Lily stood near the shed, watching with a quiet curiosity that held no fear. The man on the wagon reached beside him and lifted a small wooden crate, setting it down at the edge of the path. Then another, and another, each movement deliberate, unhurried, as if time did not press on him the way it did on others. He never spoke, not once, and when he was finished, he tipped his hat just slightly, a gesture simple and clear, then turned the wagon without waiting for thanks, guiding it back the way it had come. Eleanor watched until the wheels disappeared beyond the curve, her expression unchanged, but something deeper, settling into place, something that no longer questioned what this was or why it was happening. She turned back toward her children then, toward the shed, toward the work still waiting, and as she walked, the distance between her steps felt different, more certain, as if the path ahead was no longer something she had to imagine, but something she had already begun to walk. The crates sat at the edge of the path long after the wagon disappeared, untouched, not because Eleanor Hayes feared them, but because she understood now that everything left for her carried a choice within it, and choices, once taken, could not be returned the way unopened gifts could. The wind moved lightly across the yard, brushing against the wood of the shed, the cabin, the fence that now stood straighter than it had in years. And for a moment the land felt as if it were watching, waiting, to see what she would do next. Noah stepped closer to the crates first, his movements cautious but curious, his eyes scanning every corner as if expecting something hidden, while Lily lingered a few steps behind, her small hands clasped together, not afraid, just aware that this moment held weight she could not yet name. Eleanor followed them slowly, her gaze steady, her breathing even, and when she reached the first crate, she did not open it right away. She simply rested her hand on the wood, feeling the grain beneath her palm, grounding herself in something real before moving forward. When she finally lifted the lid, it opened without resistance. And inside there was no extravagance, no show of wealth, just tools, clean, well-made, the kind meant to last, a proper saw, a set of nails sorted by size, a coil of rope, strong enough to hold more than weight, and beneath them, wrapped carefully in cloth, a pair of gloves sized not for a man, but for hands like hers. Noah let out a quiet breath, not surprise exactly, but recognition, as if he understood that this was not about giving more, but giving what mattered. Eleanor moved to the second crate, opening it with the same care, and inside were seeds, small packets labeled in a neat, steady hand. Corn, beans, something green she had not grown in years, and for a moment she stood still, the sight of them reaching deeper than anything else, because they did not speak of survival alone. They spoke of time, of staying, of building something that would outlast a single season. Lily stepped closer then, her eyes bright, asking softly if they could plant them, and Eleanor looked at her, really looked, seeing not just a child asking a question, but a future asking to be considered, and she nodded once, slow, certain. The third crate held something different. Something quieter, a small ledger, its cover worn but intact, and when Eleanor opened it, she found not accounts of debt, not tallies to be repaid, but simple entries, names, dates, small notes written in the same steady hand, each line marking a place, a person, a need met without announcement. She turned a few pages, her fingers moving carefully, and there, near the back, she saw it, her name, Eleanor Hayes, written without flourish, followed by a single line that read, not what she owed, not what had been given, but what had been seen, widow, 2 children, stands without asking. She closed the ledger slowly, the weight of those words settling deeper than anything placed in the crates, because they did not measure her by lack, they recognized her by strength. Noah asked then, his voice quieter than before, if they were supposed to pay this back, if there would come a day when someone would ask for it all in return. And Eleanor looked at him, her eyes steady, and said that some things are not given to be returned. They are given to be carried forward. And he nodded, not fully understanding, but holding on to the meaning the way he held on to everything that mattered. She gathered the gloves, slipping them onto her hands, feeling the fit, the way they allowed her grip to settle without strain, and she picked up the saw, testing its balance, the clean edge catching the light for a brief moment before she lowered it again. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting longer shadows across the yard, and Eleanor Hayes stood there with her children beside her, the crates open, the tools ready, the seeds waiting. And she understood now that this was not the end of something given. It was the beginning of something expected, not by the man who had sent it, but by herself, by the life she had chosen to continue. And somewhere far beyond the reach of sight, a rider moved along a distant line, never turning, never asking, leaving behind not a debt, but a direction that could not be ignored. The work did not wait for permission. It rose with the sun and settled into their hands as naturally as breath, and Eleanor Hayes stepped into the morning with the gloves already worn, the leather fitting closer now, shaped by effort instead of gift. The ground behind the cabin had been hard for years, packed tight by seasons of neglect, but today it did not feel like something to endure. It felt like something to answer, and she drove the shovel down with steady force, not hurried, not hesitant, just certain, turning the earth one slice at a time while Noah followed with the rake, breaking the clumps apart, learning the rhythm not from instruction but from watching her shoulders, her pace, the way she did not stop when the work resisted. Lily moved along the edge of the space, carrying the small packets of seeds as if they were something fragile and important, her steps careful, her eyes bright with a quiet sense of purpose she had not shown before. And when Eleanor paused, she knelt beside her, opening one packet slowly, letting the small kernels fall into her palm, each one holding a promise too small to see yet too strong to ignore. The wind moved across the open land, but it no longer cut through them. It passed by, carrying the scent of turned soil, of something beginning, and Eleanor felt that shift again, deeper this time, not just in the house, not just in the yard, but in the way she stood within it. By midday, the first rows had taken shape, straight enough to hold, spaced with care, and Noah stepped back to look at them, his hands on his hips in a way that mirrored a man he barely remembered, and he said quietly that it looked like it might grow, not as a question, but as a statement he was testing against the land itself. Eleanor nodded once, not offering more than that. Because some truths needed time to prove themselves, they worked. Until the light began to soften again, until the rows stretched farther than Eleanor had planned, until the ground behind the cabin no longer looked forgotten but claimed. When she finally set the shovel aside, her hands steady despite the effort, she reached into her coat and took out the folded letter, not to read, but to hold for a moment, to feel its place in all of this. And she realized that it no longer carried the same weight it once had. It was not a plea anymore. It was a beginning. She had stepped beyond. No one noticed the letter and asked if the man had written anything back, if there was something they had missed inside it, some message hidden between the lines. And Eleanor looked at the rows of turned earth, at the tools resting nearby, at the children standing beside her, and said that sometimes the answer is not written, it is built. And he followed her gaze, understanding not with words, but with what he could see. Lily placed the last of the seeds into Eleanor's hand, her small fingers brushing against the leather glove, and she asked if they would grow tall, taller than her, and Eleanor allowed herself the smallest hint of a smile, saying that if they cared for them right, they would grow as tall as they needed to. The sun dipped lower, casting long lines across the newly turned soil, and Eleanor Hayes stood there with her children, the land no longer silent, no longer waiting, but responding. And somewhere beyond the ridge, beyond the line of sight, a man rode on without ever knowing how far his silence had carried, or how deeply it had taken root in a place he had already left behind. The days began to stack quietly, one settling into the next, without announcement, and Eleanor Hayes no longer counted them by what they lacked, but by what held steady when the sun rose and when it fell. The rows behind the cabin had started to change, not in a way that called attention, but in the subtle shift of color where the soil darkened with care, where the surface no longer lay flat and lifeless, but carried small signs of effort returning something unseen. Each morning, Eleanor walked the length of those rows before anything else, her steps slow, her eyes tracing the lines she and Noah had set with such care, and though nothing had broken through the surface yet, she did not doubt that it would, because she understood now that growth did not announce itself at the beginning. It revealed itself to those who stayed long enough to notice. Noah had taken to rising earlier, sometimes before her, standing outside with his arms crossed against the morning chill, looking over the land not as something they were stuck on, but as something they were shaping. And there was a quiet change in the way he moved, less guarded, more certain, as if each small task was teaching him that effort could lead somewhere, that time spent did not always disappear without return. Lily followed them both, no longer wrapped in the blanket every hour, her hands often dirty now from touching the soil, from placing small stones along the edges of the rows as if marking something important. And she spoke more freely, asking questions about what would grow. First, how tall the plants would be, whether they would need more space, and Eleanor answered when she could, and when she could not. She simply said they would learn together. The tools from the crate had found their places without needing to be arranged. The saw leaned where it could be reached, the rope coiled neatly near the shed, the gloves worn enough now to carry the shape of Eleanor's hands. And nothing about them felt foreign anymore, nothing felt borrowed, because each day of use had made them part of the life they were building. The ledger remained inside, resting on the shelf where the letter had once been hidden, and Eleanor had not opened it again, not because she feared what else it might contain, but because she understood that its purpose had already been fulfilled. It had shown her how she had been seen, and that was enough. One afternoon, as the lights softened and the air held that quiet pause before evening, Noah called out, his voice carrying a note Eleanor had not heard before, not urgency, but discovery, and she walked toward him, her steps steady, to see what had drawn his attention. There, in the first row, where the soil had been turned most carefully, a small break in the surface caught the light, barely visible, a thin line of green pushing upward, fragile and certain at the same time. Lily knelt beside it immediately, her breath held as if even the air might disturb it, and she whispered something too soft to hear, but her eyes held a wonder that needed no words. Eleanor did not kneel, she did not reach out, She simply stood there, looking down at that small sign, and felt something settle inside her, something deeper than relief, deeper than gratitude, a quiet understanding that what had been given to her had not ended with wood and flour and tools. It had continued into this moment, into this growth that she now had a hand in shaping. She turned her gaze toward the ridge out of habit, not expecting to see anything, and there was nothing there, only the long line of land meeting sky, unchanged and distant, and yet she did not feel the need to search it anymore, because whatever had come from there had already taken root here. Noah stood beside her, his shoulders squared in a way that belonged to someone who had found something worth standing for, and Lily reached for her hand, her small fingers warm against the leather, and Eleanor Hayes stood between them, the land no longer silent, no longer waiting, but answering in its own time, in its own quiet way, and she understood that not all help arrives to stay. Some of it arrives to begin something that must be carried forward by the ones who remain. The green shoot did not rush upward. It held its place in the soil as if it understood that strength came from staying rooted before reaching higher, and Eleanor Hayes returned to it each morning, not to measure its height, but to witness its persistence. The rows behind the cabin slowly followed, one by one, small breaks in the earth turning into lines of life that stretched farther with each passing day, and what had once been a patch of forgotten ground became something steady, something that answered effort with quiet return. Noah no longer asked if it would grow. He spoke instead of how to protect it, how to space the rows better next season, how to make sure the water reached every corner, and there was a calm certainty in his voice that had not been there before, the kind that comes when a boy begins to understand that the future is not something that happens to him, but something he can shape. Lily moved through the rows with careful steps, no longer afraid to touch the fragile leaves, her laughter soft and brief when she found a new sprout, and sometimes she would sit beside them, humming the same quiet tune, as if the plants themselves could hear her and choose to grow just a little stronger. The cabin stood firm through the changing days, the wind pressing against it without finding a way in, the door closing clean, the fire holding steady, and every small detail that had once spoken of wear and weakness now spoke of care, of hands that had returned to their purpose. The tools bore the marks of use, no longer new, no longer separate from the life around them, and Eleanor wore the gloves without thinking, her grip sure, her movements practiced, as if she had always known how to build what needed building. The letter remained where she had placed it, not hidden, not displayed, simply present, a quiet reminder of a moment that had begun something she now carried forward without needing to look back. One evening, as the sun lowered itself behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the rows that now stood clear and certain, Eleanor paused at the edge of the field, her hands resting still, her breath slow, and she allowed herself to look out toward that distant line where sky met land, not searching, not waiting, just acknowledging. There was no rider there, no movement to mark the place, and yet the absence no longer felt like distance, it felt complete, as if whatever needed to pass between them had already done so without words, without return. Noah stood beside her, taller now in the way he carried himself, and Lily slipped her hand into Eleanor's, her fingers warm, steady, and together they faced the land that no longer felt like something they endured, but something they belonged to. Eleanor Hayes did not speak, because there was nothing left to ask, no answer left to seek, only the quiet understanding that what had been given to her had not come to change her life in a single moment, but to remind her that she had always been capable of changing it herself, and somewhere far beyond the reach of sight, beyond the roads and ridges and miles that stretched between one life and another, a man rode on beneath the same fading light, never knowing that the silence he left behind had grown into something strong enough to stand on its own. Because out here, justice does not arrive with noise or demand. It settles in the quiet spaces between people and stays, only as long as it is carried forward by those who choose to keep walking.